Hey everybody, we're back with some students from UT Austin and the CEO of Dominant Strategies. They're working on a project called BlockReduce. Jonathan Downing, a computer engineering undergrad at UT Austin, is here to introduce the presentation about this project. Jonathan.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Jonathan Downing and I'm a computer engineering student at UT. I worked with Karl, Kreder, and others on research related to scaling distributed systems and blockchains for about a year and a half before we decided to make an implementation and a paper regarding our research. Our research is called BlockReduce, and it's a method for scaling blockchains in a distributed and decentralized fashion. Karl Kreder is a previous PhD from UT and has a PhD in materials science and engineering. Karl, I'll let you get started.
Awesome. Excited to have you, Karl. Thanks for joining us and looking forward to your presentation.
Appreciate it. So Dominant Strategies, as Jonathan mentioned, is a company that spun out of research that was done at UT called BlockReduce. We've gotten funding from an SBIR, and we're using that to make an implementation of BlockReduce. And the goal of the company in doing that is to create the world's decentralized digital currency. So what do I mean by that? A lot of people think that there will be many digital currencies in the future, but I would argue the digital currency landscape will ultimately follow a Kreder distribution, and there will be one or two dominant cryptocurrencies in the future. And the ones that gain the largest amount of market share will be the ones that offer the greatest utility for the lowest cost. So realizing BlockReduce, allowing a blockchain to scale, we hope we'll be able to offer the greatest amount of utility for the lowest cost and be one of the large market share holders in the future. So here's the founding team. That includes myself as the CEO, as well as Yanni, Jonathan, Sriram, and also Alan. So what are the market pains of cryptocurrencies as they exist? As we see it, it's the issue of centralization juxtaposed against the issue of scalability. So if a blockchain is able to scale, it usually makes a compromise in centralization. Or if a blockchain is centralized, it's able to scale, but a decentralized blockchain isn't able to scale. So what we think BlockReduce is able to do is basically find a balance between centralization and scalability to make a much more useful blockchain when compared to something like Ethereum or Bitcoin. So the big sort of Achilles heel with Bitcoin and Ethereum is the number of transactions per second that you can get on the blockchain. So Bitcoin can do roughly 7 transactions per second, or TPS, and Ethereum can do roughly 14 transactions per second. So our goal is to make a blockchain which essentially doesn't have an upper limit in terms of transactions per second. And that's where BlockReduce comes in. One thing that I've discovered from my experience doing blockchain consulting at Consensus Systems is that many of companies that are looking to use blockchains for enterprise applications, specifically public decentralized blockchains, can't actually do so because of this transaction per second limitation on current public blockchains. Additionally, they don't ever have a guaranteed cost of a transaction. So they don't know that they can get a transaction on the blockchain, and they don't know at what cost they can get a transaction on the blockchain. So if you look at this chart here, you can see that at some point, over the last few years, Bitcoin transactions have cost sub $1, but during busy times, that can spike up to $30. So if you're trying to build an enterprise application and your cost to use the blockchain can vary by 20, 30, 50, 100 times, it's very hard to make a feasible economic use case for that. So enter BlockReduce. There's 3 things that we're looking to add to blockchain with BlockReduce, and that's scalability, security, and allowing the blockchain to self-optimize. So BlockReduce is a proof-of-work managed hierarchy of merge mined blockchains. And in doing so, we intrinsically change the characteristics of a blockchain to allow all 3 of those features to exist simultaneously. So this is kind of a pictorial representation of BlockReduce, and in the hierarchy of merge-mined blockchains, we kind of have three different levels. The highest level is what we call the prime blockchain. The subordinate level to that is regions, and the subordinate level to that is zones. So effectively, what we've done is we've created a multi-threaded hash-linked set of blockchains that allows us to increase throughput while maintaining proof of work against a single form of consensus. So unlike something like proof of stake, where you use sort of a political voting strategy on many shards of a blockchain, because these blockchains are merge mined, all of the miners are eventually coming to consensus on one canonical outcome, even though not all of them are having to keep full state. So what is our business model for dominant strategies? Our primary business model is to develop BlockReduce and launch it as a protocol token, and then generate revenue from the sale of the sort of founders' shares of those tokens. But in addition to that, we offer consulting services as well as software services, specifically to use the BlockReduce protocol and eventually the protocol token that we're going to launch. So what is our strategy for market adoption? We think that the biggest, well, one of the issues with getting blockchains into the market and getting them adopted by many market participants is setting up the incentives correctly. So a lot of times blockchains historically have had these arguments, especially public blockchains, about mining being fair, or a fair quote unquote distribution of tokens. Our mindset is that it's not necessarily about the fairness quote unquote, because that's not really an objective term or metric. The real idea is to use the protocol and to use the token allocations to incentivize the greatest number of market participants to participate in that new system, because by getting more market participants in the system, you're increasing the value for all market participants. So that intrinsically should be how the token reward mechanisms are set up. So what are we doing? We're basically going to have a large portion of the tokens allocated to not a mining reward, but rather to allocate it to key market players to try to get those market players to adopt this particular token protocol and to participate in the system. So some of the key market players would be financial institutions, corporates, as well as commercial banks and governments. So an example of that, how to set up a good market incentive there, in our opinion, would be for a given country that has a treasury as well as a central bank, which is independent from a treasury, is they are competing for a single token allocation to either the commercial or the central bank or the government treasury. So if the central bank decides to take the token allocation first and the government treasury doesn't get it, if the government treasury decides to take the token allocation first, then the central bank doesn't get it. And that creates a competitive incentive for people to be early adopters and to essentially get their token allocation as early as possible. We're also looking at having a decay curve such that the earliest adopters to sign on to the protocol essentially get more tokens than later adopters. So why is dominant strategies unique sort of in the overall ecosystem of new blockchains out there? This graph kind of creates a sort of a trade-off of what really most blockchains have been dealing with in terms of throughput versus decentralized and centralized. And if we look at Bitcoin, Bitcoin was very decentralized, but it also had very low throughput. And the trend that we've been seeing is that people are looking to increase throughput, but they're doing so by compromising that decentralization. So this is being done by either having, proof of stake or, different protocols that cause centralization of the consensus mechanism, like DPoS, or various other mechanisms. So instead of maintaining that decentralization while increasing throughput, they're actually centralizing blockchains while increasing throughput, and they're making themselves look a lot more like systems like Visa or MasterCard rather than like true blockchains. So in contrast to that, dominant strategies with the BlockReduce protocol is trying to maintain that decentralization while also simultaneously increasing throughput to Visa, MasterCard throughput levels. So this is just an idea of what we think the addressable market share is. Obviously, the immediate use of the market is the current cryptocurrency market, but then after that, you can look at payment processors, and if you really see ubiquitous adoption of crypto tokens, if you look at broad money worldwide, it's almost $100 trillion. So one of the things to consider with tokens and protocol tokens in particular, the primary source of value isn't necessarily direct revenue to the company, but is revenue realized through the initial allocation of tokens, which gain value as market use increases. So yeah, here's kind of a timeline for dominant strategies. So we released our initial paper at the end of 2018. We wrote a paper on HashCore, which is a more decentralized hashing algorithm in 2019. We also managed to get SBIR funding in 2019, and we're currently working on basically getting to a testnet that has that implementation of BlockReduce, and that should be sometime this summer. And with that, I'll take any questions.